Well, we're reviewing some of the top headlines this week in the run-up to the elections and also during and after the elections. And I have in the studio with me Mr. Frank Aigbogun. He's the CEO and publisher of BusinessDay Nigeria. I also have in the studio with me Professor Pat Utomi, a political economist. Thank you so much, gentlemen. A pleasure, a real pleasure to have you in the studio. Now, let's talk about the new Nigeria under the President-elect General Muhammadu Buhari. A lot has been said about, in terms of expectations, what he should do first, what should be his first areas of focus. But there appears to be a larger discourse going on at the same time, saying that, an analyst saying that they feel or they believe that he should begin to unite Nigeria. Professor, you want to go first?
Well, the starting point, really, after a divisive election, is a recognition that it will take everybody to build a country. And so a true leader must begin to bring people together. And General Buhari recognizes this, and this is why in his maiden address after the election results, he made that point. There are going to be people who are on different sides of the divide. But as Lyndon Baines Johnson said long ago and became the mantra of the Malaysians, it's better for everybody to be inside the house, pissing out, than for a few people to be outside, pissing in. And so that is the first order of business. And he will show it by the kind of people he consults with and he brings around him and says, look, after every election, candidates have to recognize that they were candidates of a party, but the elect of the whole country. They have to govern the whole country, whether the people voted for them or not. And so I think that's where we'll go.
Okay, Frank, let's share your thoughts.
I agree with Prof. I think the morning after, the button begins to get heavier, and I'm sure that Buhari feels that already. As you've said, I think there is a sense in which focus must now be on, healing or attempting to heal the wound. But there's also the idea that the expectations of Nigerians are quite high. My hope is that the healing of the wound and then, of course, the real job of governance can happen side by side and very quickly too.
Now, Professor, I mean, how much progress can we make perhaps in the first 4 years before we approach the next elections? Can we, or are we on the path of what we've seen, the president, the incumbent conceding defeat? Are we on the path, or can we get to the point where Nigerians will be so united that we will begin to not vote along religious and ethnic lines, that those lines can become blurred? 4 years at what point?
Well, how we lead will make a difference in how that, evolves. Obviously, it's a matter of evolution. How we also teach history is important. One of the failings of our country is that we don't teach history anymore, and we don't teach it well. I say to people all the time that history is really a collection of myths that enable the present generation to try and outdo itself because of its beliefs about its founding fathers and all of that. So, a number of things are very important. The new leaders must communicate to the world that what matters, communicate to the people, is the welfare, the common good of the people, and that's all that should count. And how we teach history to show that where that was not the case, we went wrong, will enable young people cling on to moments like President Jonathan making that concession speech as part of what makes you truly Nigerian, the nobility of spirit to say our country must move forward.
Okay, well, let's just quickly take one of the first articles that we're going to be thrashing out here. Well, that's been taken from the Guardian newspaper, where looking at the headline, Buhari sweeps in. That's still part of what we're talking about here. Now, Frank, let me read out some of the comments being read out by Buhari put in the papers, where he says that we shall strongly, I'm quoting him now, we shall strongly battle another form of evil that is even worse than terrorism, that's the evil of corruption. He also says that we shall end this threat to our economic development and democratic survival. I repeat that corruption will not be tolerated by this administration. We saw this theme running in the APC campaign in the run-up to the elections, during the elections, corruption, fighting corruption, and of course security. Obviously, he's going to make this his first areas of focus. Can you speak to that point?
Well, let's talk about corruption. I mean, clearly that was the cardinal point in Buhari's campaign. And I think that for many who support him, that support draws from the high expectation that they have, that one, he has the inclination to do something, and that two, he will have the capacity to do something about corruption. And I have higher expectations that he will. Some people say it's such a difficult task. It can be.
It probably will be, because there's talk that it's so ingrained in our system,
yes.
in our institutions.
Yes.
Will he get the cooperation that he needs with the people who are already in the system?
You see, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to do something about corruption. I mean, I'll give you an example. The power sector was riddled with corruption for many years. Once you took that out of government and handed it to the private sector, at least the extent to which the assets have been privatized.
Well, there was talk about who in the private sector those power assets were even handed over to.
Well,
even that was said to be a corrupt process.
I differ a bit, and I'm sure Prof will support me here. I mean, the question I asked my colleagues, journalists who had such views, was, do you have money to buy? It's the guy who has money that will buy. I mean...
Professor,
by the way, if the fellow is very corrupt and acquires it corruptly, if he can't manage it, it will quickly move to somebody who can manage it. That's the beauty of, private sector led processes. But I think to talk about corruption, we need to get back to a certain understanding that even though it is perceived that corruption is systemic, in fact, there's a book that I like to quote very much. It goes back, Corruption and Development in Africa, Bonwell Hope and Bonwell Chukulo. It goes something like, corruption runs a spectrum in Africa from rare in Botswana to widespread in Ghana to systemic in Nigeria. But let me tell you a thing about whether it's systemic or not, the power of personal example. When the people at the top are seen as people of integrity, are seen as transparent, down there people will fear to get into even petty corruption.
Okay.
But when it's perceived that, the game is being played upstairs, then it will be impossible, not impossible, to say to the people down there, you can do it. So personal example is so important.
Okay, I just wanted to bring up this last point on corruption before we move to the Nigerian economy. Now, General Buhari has said that he will not go on a witch hunt. There's a headline that we tweeted where he says that President Jonathan has nothing to fear. Now, we also know that, fighting corruption also means, or could also mean, righting the wrongs of the past. Now, if he takes a stance that, okay, I'm not going to witch hunt anybody, we're just going to move forward, what if, I'm not the one saying this, this is some of the articles I've read in the papers also, what if, the general and his team uncover corruption scandals or, things that are probably too significant to ignore, that the people begin to demand justice? What happens?
Well, in my view, the general needs to be a father of all, but that doesn't mean that he will set a new law for the country. If there is a problem that needs to be dealt with, it ought to be dealt with. He's saying that he won't witch hunt. It's an important thing to say. But if there is an infraction that needs to be dealt with, it should be dealt with.
Okay.
All right, this is a country under law. That's the key, rule of law.
Let's move on to the economy that the president-elect has inherited, if you will. I can use that word from the incumbents. Now, of course, we know we're facing a lot of fiscal headwinds. We're looking at lower oil prices. We're looking at lower government revenues. We're looking at even lower forex reserves, even the excess crude accounts. Now, in one of the articles where the finance minister complained that, look, the governors kept complaining that, or she kept saying, let's save for a rainy day. But the governor said, look, it's raining already. Why have money in the coffers when we need money to develop our, our individual states? Now, the reserves have been depleted, but General Buhari has that to deal with. Frank?
My expectation is that General Buhari will be able to create a consensus around the idea of saving, whether at the state level or at the federal level. But yes, it's not a very good economy that Buhari will be inheriting. It's not in a very good shape, especially if you look at the budget that is currently before the National Assembly. Whatever little provision we made in the past for capital expenditure is virtually gone under the circumstances of the depleting oil revenues. But I think there's a lot that can be done to show up provision for capital expenditure and spending on infrastructure. There is always this argument about government revenues in Nigeria, especially if you look at government revenues as a ratio of GDP. Even among its peers, Nigeria ranks very, very low. There's an idea that we have been interrogating at BusinessDay to just look at the huge revenues of the parastatals, the MDAs, that really never come under the radar. We think that is possibly where the hole is. And we expect a person like Buhari to begin to plug those holes and bring that under the oversight of the National Assembly. Okay,
now, Professor, do you expect him to push through, I mean, with existing reforms? We've seen the privatization in power sector, that's still ongoing, of the still some feeding challenges. What are your expectations in terms of how, are we going to see new policies? Is it going to build on existing reforms?
It makes sense to build on existing reforms where they are making the system run better. But I'd like to make a point that I don't worry as much. Actually, I see this as an opportunity. The troubles in the economy is more an opportunity for me than a threat. Look, the foreign reserves that we have were built up when crude oil prices were at $38 a barrel under Obasanjo. So why are we getting so excited when prices are still higher than that? In reality is that there was a complete loss of discipline in the system. It was this loss of discipline which, when there's example of discipline in the system, immediately covers for. And you'll be amazed. I was around here when crude oil prices came to less than $10 a barrel in 1998, 99, and we functioned. So the world, this is for me, see, Nigeria must produce. The time is now to turn to producing. The problem of Nigeria, in my view, has always been that as a political party, the PDP's frame for being was a place for elite accommodation in the sharing of rent from an enclave sector. Once you kill that mindset, Nigeria can produce its way out of its current challenges because its real strength is a demographic dividend that is waiting to be reaped, and you pushed it into split the country up into zones of development, value chains, into global markets, and Nigeria's growth, ensuring competitiveness in all of those value chains will come.
All right. Frank, before we take a break, I wanted us, earlier we were talking about the budget, and incidentally it hasn't been passed, but they had actually reached, the lawmakers and the executive had reached an agreement on what the oil benchmark will be and how much they will spend for the year, over 4 trillion, with, although we had a high expenditure, 2.2 trillion, and a capital expenditure of around 634 billion. What's going to happen to the budget now?
Well, I'm not sure what the frame of mind of the outgoing administration is, but my expectation is that going forward, there has to be consultation between the current administration and representatives of the incoming administration. It's just as simple. It's like if you have a business and you're doing a deal for somebody to take significant equity in that business, you can't begin to hire a CFO or a CEO without reference to the guy even before he sits in on the board. So I think that's obvious, that there has to be consultation. There has to be, otherwise the new government comes and just, takes it apart, and it will be right to go ahead and format a new budget. Okay, well, hold your thoughts for us. We'll take a break at this point, Professor Frank. Just a few minutes away. We've been looking at some of the top headlines in Nigeria's national dailies, from the Business Day down to The Guardian. I've been talking to Frank Aigbogun, the CEO and publisher of Business Day, and of course, Professor Pat Utomi, a political economist. We've been looking at some of the top headlines in the run-up to the election, and of course, all about the election. I've been talking to Professor Pat Utomi, political economist, and of course, Frank Aigbogun, the CEO and publisher of Business Day. Thank you so much, gentlemen. Still a pleasure to have you. Now, let's talk about, let's look deeper into the issue of corruption. I was reading some comments from former President Olusegun Obasanjo, and after congratulating General Buhari, the first thing he actually told him was to build our institutions. So I could see that he was very passionate about that, because he said, if we're going to tackle this demon or this monster, if you will, called corruption, we need to build our institutions. Professor, you'd like to go first? Well, the big challenge of now is a challenge of institution building, is a challenge of values. There's a collapse of culture. And institutions and culture are very closely related in terms of how you ensure that there are boundaries that reduce uncertainty. Investment challenges are a function of people looking at an environment, trying to see if there are boundaries. You know, that if the boundaries are not there, then they are afraid to go in, because if anything happens, they won't be protected. So building the institutions of transparency in government is a very critical job. General Obasanjo himself named a big committee that worked on that about 2000. I happen to have chaired that committee to look at institutions of transparency in government. But he didn't implement most of what we suggested anyway, so that's part of the trouble. We need now a czar on corruption, a corruption czar. Somebody,
if General Obasanjo, you know, if some things hadn't happened, he would be the ideal person to ask, sir, can you be this czar? But people like General Ishola Williams still have enough of the credibility and all of that to be named a corruption czar. Then you say to Lamode, you know, and all these other people in running, you report to this fellow, you clear with him, nobody, I mean, he will get these governors, because part of the problem is that there are many people who, in this age of impunity, are above the law, and they get away with things. And that gives a signal that we're not serious about corruption. So you need somebody like an Ishola Williams who will say, go and get that governor of that state, and that kind of thing. So,
okay, so Frank, you think that that narrative, that previous commentary on Nigeria where corruption is concerned would change? The professor talked about we need somebody, czar. Do you see that in General Buhari, and do you think that he can begin to change that commentary, especially in the eyes of the international community, as they look into Nigeria?
General Buhari has committed to changing the landscape with regards to corruption. And people believe that he has the capacity to do it as well. So my expectation is that a lot will change.
They believe that, is it because he was a former army general, or because the previous government that he ran back in the 1980s, that was his message then, to come in, clean up the corrupt government that he said was in power then?
All of this is part of it, but not all of it. I guess the most important thing here is his own character. People have said all manner of things about everybody in Nigeria. And you know, in Nigeria, it's very easy to say this man is corrupt. One thing no one has said about Buhari is that he's corrupt.
Interesting. Well, let's move on to President Jonathan's legacy. Well, he has accepted defeat, and he has been lauded for it both locally and internationally. Do you think that this changes Nigeria's previous commentary on transition of governments in Africa? We're talking earlier that we're going to have, we still have 15 more elections here in Africa. So is this at a good tune?
It was so important that he did what he did, because this year is so important for transitions, for democracy in Africa. And Nigeria setting a good example was really, really going to be the marker. And with what President Jonathan did, he sent the signal, and we can take that and go to other African countries and say, so what happened in Nigeria? We must follow this track. So that is his legacy. Ultimately, because there are so many challenges. I think during the 5.5 years that he was there was a fundamental weakness that allowed so much impunity, that allowed so much corruption. So in the final analysis, that moment was his legacy. And that's what we must use as a banner and hand across the continent.
Frank, you think that's what he will be remembered for going forward?
I think everything Prof said is absolutely spot on. But I also say that, you know, one of the paradoxes is that a man and an administration characterized by such words as weak and all that, certainly, is the same administration that I believe has bequeathed upon Nigeria a better series of elections. There may be an exception, but I think that since the first election in his time, it was a senatorial by-election in Edo State, to the Peter Obi's second election, to Governor Adams Oshomole's election, you have had something, away from what we were used to in the past. You know, less of the impunity, and I think if you then add that to the very graceful speech he made to concede defeat and to congratulate the president-elect, I think Jonathan indeed has given us the real gift for our democracy.
Professor, do you think that this, his speech conceding defeat, did you think that ran through the entire PDP camp? What I meant was, do you think, did they act alone, or is this something that, okay, this was unanimous, we all, the PDP, including President Jonathan, sat down and said, you know what, let's accept, and, you know, Mr. President, you can go ahead and, or is it the man himself,
what it takes
the
to
man
be a
Jonathan
leader
himself who did it?
is to take that dramatic moment and do, I can bet you that if he put it to vote, there's no way that would have happened. The drama that was playing out with Mr. Urubebe and all of that was really part of a script. And if he didn't make a personal decision, that moment was like Yeltsin's decision to stand in front of that tank. That was the moment that Goodluck Jonathan gave us. And so it's a personal leadership thing for which he should always be remembered. I don't think his party would have gone that way if they sat down to try and review things.
I've been asking myself, what next for President, well, he's still the president, Goodluck Jonathan. Frank, what do you suppose he's going to do next after from May 29th?
Jonathan, I mean, don't forget, this is a man who was deputy governor, never thought to be governor, became governor after the impeachment of his boss. He never thought to be anything else. He became vice president. He never thought to be anything after that. He became president. In a country of 170 million people, he stands out in terms of the grace of God upon him. God has been kind, in fact, kinder to Jonathan. So I don't think Jonathan should have issues about his future. History would give him a good future.
Professor,
there's plenty for him to do. He can sit back and reflect on the years he was in office and write us a couple of good books. He's an academic, and so that, and when he finishes doing that, he can travel the world giving lectures. And that is a very busy life.
And he wouldn't carry that previous image that Nigeria had, because, you know, it would appear that his administration was characterized, because if you read international media, it's always corruption, insecurity in the north that went out of control. You think, so when he walks that image, he no longer carries that image.
We live in a very forgiving world. You do one right thing, and it forgives all the wrongs that you have done. So you can take that and run with you. I mean, General Obasanjo, what is his claim to fame? That he walked away in 1979. That's it. I mean, General Obasanjo was not the most democratic of people. I mean, this is a man who had beware of dogs and journalists. You know, so, but he was forgiven everything. So I think that in many ways, Goodluck Jonathan will be forgiven plenty because he took that moment.
Okay, gentlemen, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much for being on the show. It's been a pleasure having you, sharing your thoughts with us, your perspective on the way forward for Nigeria, and of course, as we chart a new course going forward. I've been speaking to Frank Aigbogun, editor and CEO of BusinessDay newspaper, and of course, Professor Pat Utomi, a political economist, looking at some of the headlines, of course, all about the elections, the new president, the president-elect, General Muhammadu Buhari.